Would you dare to spend a night alone in a morgue? A place where silence does not mean peace, but rather the waiting for something that should no longer be there. Today, I will take you through 3 terrifying stories that happened behind the cold doors of a morgue. 3 stories so disturbing that they will make you look at the steel tables and cold drawers in a different way forever. Get ready, because tonight the line between life and death will disappear, and what lives in the darkness does not want to be forgotten. The first time Jonathan Scott stepped foot in the city morgue, he felt a chill that wasn't just from the air conditioning. It was a deeper chill, as if the very structure of the building exuded an icy presence, an absence of warmth and life that embraced him in an almost palpable way. At the time, he was a man in his early 30s, and he took the job because of its simplicity. Night watchman. All he had to do was make sure no one entered or left without authorization. He never imagined that decades later, he would still be there, but with a much more terrible truth unfolding before his eyes. Time passed, and Jonathan grew accustomed to the solitude of the night shifts. The hours were long, but the silence of the morgue was almost comforting. He knew he was dealing with the remnants of people, but they were no longer people. They were bodies, soulless matter. Harmless, or at least that's what he believed. However, everything began to change when the morgue was refurbished. The modernization brought in security cameras. At that point, Jonathan had been in the same job for over 20 years. His routine was simple: monitor the screens, make occasional rounds, and record any incidents, which until then had never happened. But the cameras changed something in the atmosphere of the place, something Jonathan couldn't put a name to at first, as if suddenly the dead knew they were being watched. It was a typical morning, the kind Jonathan had experienced hundreds of times before. He sat in the chair in front of the security screens, the images flashing in black and white. The morgue was empty as usual, except for the cold bodies sealed in their metal drawers or stretched out on gurneys, awaiting autopsies the following day. In the early evening, nothing out of the ordinary. The minutes dragged by until around 2:47 a.m., Jonathan saw something that made his eyes widen. On the screen showing the autopsy room, a body that should have been motionless moved its arm. A subtle movement, like a spasm, but enough to make Jonathan's heart race. He blinked several times, moving closer to the screen to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The body didn't move anymore. Maybe it was a post-mortem reflex, he thought. Something natural, a muscle spasm. It was possible, right? But then it happened again. This time, the body turned slightly to the side, as if trying to stand up. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. The autopsy room was completely empty except for that body. No one was there to move it. His first impulse was to go over there, check it out for himself, but his legs faltered. "You're just tired," he thought, trying to calm himself. "This can't be happening. There must be an explanation." He looked away at the other screens. In the cadaver storage room, a drawer, which he was sure was closed, was now slightly ajar. A sense of dread began to build in Jonathan's chest, slow and heavy, like an invisible hand squeezing his heart. He picked up the radio, his fingers shaking, and called for the supervisor, but the radio was silent. No answer. He was alone, as always. The next few nights became a blur of increasing terror. Each shift brought new disturbances. Bodies he had seen up close, sealed in drawers, appeared in different positions on the cameras. Most disturbing was how each one acted in a unique way. One of the corpses, a young woman, appeared smiling at the camera, her teeth bared, although Jonathan was certain that at the time of the autopsy, her lips had been sewn shut. Another body, that of an elderly man, appeared to be crying blood, dark spots forming around his closed eyes. Are they alive? Jonathan wondered, his mind trying to make sense of the impossible. But he knew this wasn't life. Not really. It was something else. Something much worse. As the shifts went on, the voices began. Low, barely audible at first, whispers that seemed to come directly from the screens. Jonathan began to hear the sound of muffled laughter, as if the dead were mocking him, knowing he watched them helplessly. And then, one night, he heard his own name, a hoarse whisper, coming from all directions at once. Jonathan. He spun around in his chair, but there was no one there. Of course not. No one but the dead. From that night on, he stopped making his rounds in the morgue. If I can't see them up close, they can't touch me, he repeated to himself, like a kind of mantra. He stayed confined to the control room, his eyes fixed on the screens, waiting, or rather, fearing what might happen next. And each night, the bodies became more audacious. Some rose from their stretchers, others laughed uncontrollably. The cameras never recorded the events, they only showed them while Jonathan watched. It was as if the images existed only for him, a personal provocation. The physical and mental exhaustion began to eat away at Jonathan's sanity. He stopped sleeping at home, afraid that the smiling faces and empty eyes of the corpses would invade his dreams. When he managed to doze off, he would wake with a sudden sensation that there was something or someone in his room, watching him in the dark. The walls of the morgue seemed to close in on him during his shifts. The once sterile and cold environment now pulsed with a dark life, an energy that was invisible but unbearably present. The cameras captured the impossible, but eventually Jonathan began to see things off-screen. As he walked through the empty hallways of the morgue, he swore he heard footsteps behind him. Sometimes the lights would flicker and he would see silhouettes standing in the corners of the rooms, watching him. But when he blinked, they would disappear. During one of these hallucinations, he saw the figure of a woman standing at the end of the hallway. She was motionless, her black hair covering her face. He knew she was one of the dead. She whispered, "I'm waiting for you, Jonathan." The sounds of laughter, crying, and screaming began to follow him home. He could no longer escape. The morgue was becoming a part of him, and he a part of the morgue. Jonathan began to question his own existence. He would look in the mirror, and sometimes he didn't recognize the man in the mirror. His face was paler, his eyes sunken into shadowy sockets. Sometimes the reflection would smile back at him, though Jonathan knew it wasn't smiling. Am I dead? The question haunted his mind with every step. Maybe he had already crossed the line. Maybe he was just another body in that morgue, a body that still moved by sheer inertia, unable to accept the truth. One night, he decided to put an end to it. He decided to confront the morgue head-on, without fear. If he was going to go crazy, he might as well do it quickly. If there was something waiting for him in the darkness, he wanted to know. During his shift, he grabbed his flashlight and walked the halls with feverish determination. The lights flickered, and he knew something was following him, He could feel the presence approaching.
"Jonathan,"
the voices whispered, louder now. He reached the autopsy room, the same one that had started it all. The woman's body was there, lying on the gurney. Her face was turned toward the camera, her lips smiling. Jonathan swallowed hard, fear freezing his insides. Slowly, he approached the gurney. When he was a few feet away, the woman sat up. Her eyes were open, blank, but there was a wicked glee in her expression. Jonathan tried to move away, but his feet wouldn't obey. She slowly raised her hand and pointed at him. "You are next." That night, Jonathan didn't come home. He disappeared. The morgue, however, kept running. The bodies kept coming in, and the shifts went on as usual. A few weeks later, a new watchman was hired, a young man eager to make a little money. He started his first shift at the same morgue in the same camera room. As he watched the security screens, something caught his eye. One of the bodies moved. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but then the body turned. It was a man with sunken eyes and a look of deep terror on his face. The name on the morgue form? Jonathan Scott. The new watchman stared at the screens with a nervous smile, unaware that, like all the others before him, he too was being watched, and the silent cameras continued to capture what no one was supposed to see. Robert wasn't sure how he'd ended up in this job. The morgue wasn't the kind of place he'd imagined his life would be. But there he was, walking down a hallway that seemed to go on forever. He'd been assigned to the most isolated wing of the morgue, a place the staff called the Forgotten Zone. It was the repository for the unidentified bodies, the lost souls, the ones no one had ever sought or mourned. As his footsteps echoed down the hallway, he felt a slight pressure in his chest. The air felt different here. It was heavy, almost palpable, as if something invisible was watching his every move. The dim overhead lights flickered sporadically, casting shadows that distorted incomprehensible ways. There was a tension in the air, something primal and frightening, as if death itself had a special domain in this wing. For the first day, Robert ignored the discomfort. The bodies stored there were shrouded in a morbid stillness, as harmless as they would be in any other part of the morgue. However, the silence of this ward felt different. It was not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting, patient, in the invisible depths of the air. As the days passed, he began to notice something strange. There was a persistent feeling of being watched, not by his coworkers, but by something more subterranean. It was as if a pair of invisible eyes were fixed on him, always lurking, waiting for him to be distracted, to relax. This feeling followed him wherever he went in the ward, like a sticky shadow that refused to let go. On the third night, the whispers began. At first, they were indistinct, like the wind whistling through the cracks in the doors, or the distant sound of someone talking in another room. Robert tried to ignore them, but the whispers grew louder as he approached the last row of bodies. They came from somewhere he couldn't identify. There were muffled words echoing through empty hallways, or maybe not so empty. Robert. The first time he heard his name, he froze. The sound was so clear, so precise, that he was sure there was someone beside him. He turned sharply, gasping, but he was alone, or at least he seemed to be. He felt a chill run up his spine, a chill that penetrated his skin, rooted in his bones. From that moment on, everything changed. The whispers became more frequent, and now he understood them clearly. They called his name, not aggressively, but seductively, alluringly. They seemed to come from inside the refrigerated cabinets where the anonymous bodies were stored. Each time he passed by, the whispers intensified, promising him secrets beyond comprehension, promising eternal life. Robert began to have strange dreams. Dreams where he walked through an endless abyss, and ahead of him, a distant light drew him, calling him. In the dreams, he felt the need to follow that light, even though he knew, somewhere deep in his mind, that that light was not salvation, but condemnation. Still, he walked, unable to resist. In the morgue, the whispers began to shape his thoughts. They promised a freedom he didn't fully understand, a power beyond life and death. But there was a price. There was always a price. All you have to do is open the door. The phrase rang in his mind night after night. A door always locked, located at the end of the wing. It was a door that no other staff member seemed to mention, as if they didn't know it existed. It was old, worn, and never seemed to be opened. Robert's own boss had told him to ignore it, claiming it was just an old storage room and that there was nothing inside that interested him. But the whispers knew otherwise. Robert began to spend more time in that wing, walking the halls as if hypnotized. Each night, the temptation to open the door grew. The whispers became more insistent, and the promise of eternity became more and more seductive. One night, as the morgue fell silent, Robert could resist no longer. He walked like a sleepwalker to the door. His sweaty hands gripped the cold doorknob. The metal seemed to pulse in his palm, as if it had a life of its own, as if it knew what was about to happen. "Open up, Robert." The voice sounded directly in his head, reverberating in his gut. He turned the doorknob with a click that echoed down the hallway. The door opened slowly, and the air that escaped from within was dense, heavy, as if it came from a place that did not belong to reality. Robert was enveloped by a suffocating darkness. On the other side, there was no room, but an abysmal void. It was a black hole that sucked in everything around him, including his sanity. The walls seemed to fold inward, as if they were being swallowed by something alive and hungry. "Come," the voice whispered, now louder, more intense. "Come to eternity." Robert took a step forward, mesmerized by the void. He felt a presence around him, something ancient, something waiting for him. His heart was beating so fast it seemed to jump out of his chest, but he could not stop. He was being pulled, drawn into that abyss. When he took the second step, he felt something tighten around his ankle. He looked down and saw that the ground around him was beginning to disintegrate, as if reality was falling apart. Ghostly hands emerged from the ground, long, thin fingers grabbing him, holding him tightly. He tried to pull his leg away, but the hands wouldn't budge. Then he saw them, the unidentified bodies, the lost souls, the forgotten, were there, in the void. Their twisted, lifeless faces watched him, their empty eyes shining with ancient terror. They were the ones who called to him, the ones who never found rest, the ones who awaited the arrival of another. "You are one of us now." Robert tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. The void enveloped him completely, hands pulling him in, his vision blurring as darkness consumed him. He drowned in the abyss, while the whispers surrounded him, echoing in his mind. And then, silence. The next day, his co-workers found him in front of the locked door, his eyes open, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. No one understood what had happened, and soon he became just another body in the forgotten ward, stored next to those who called his name. But the door remained locked, and the whispers, well, they were still there, waiting for the next one. The morgue was silent, except for the constant sound of raindrops hitting the dirty windows. It was a violent storm, the kind that seemed to envelop the building in a cocoon of shadows and muffled sounds. Edward, the technician in charge of the night shift, walked slowly through the cold hallways, lit only by the flickering fluorescent lights. It was a lonely, repetitive routine, but one to which he was accustomed. What he didn't know was that tonight, something forgotten in the darkest, most shadowy corner of the morgue was about to awaken. Hidden behind a pile of old boxes, a dust-covered jar sat, untouched for years. Inside it floated a grotesque, deformed creature that had been preserved in formaldehyde. The thing looked half animal, half human, with lifeless eyes and twisted limbs. No one knew exactly what it was, or how it had gotten there. Some said it was a medical experiment. Others whispered stories of ancient curses. But over time, it was forgotten. Until that night, the jar cracked. The storm raging outside caused the walls of the morgue to vibrate. Suddenly, a deafening clap of thunder shook the entire building, and a thin crack ran across the glass of the jar. The formaldehyde began to slowly drain out, dripping onto the floor with a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Edward, busy filling out reports in the next room, did not hear the jar shatter completely. He did not see the viscous liquid spread across the floor, nor did he notice the subtle movement of the creature that had been held in suspension for so many years. But the thing was free now, and it was hungry. First, its misshapen limbs moved slowly, as if testing the limits of a new body. Its thin, sharp claws scratched at the tiled floor, while its grotesque head swiveled inhumanly, its lifeless eyes now glowing with primal malevolence. The acrid smell of formaldehyde mixed with the odor of rotting flesh, and the creature, still crawling, began to crawl down the hallway, leaving a trail of mucus and darkness. Edward, on the other hand, felt a growing unease. The morgue had always been an uncomfortable place, but there was something different tonight. The electricity in the air seemed to carry an invisible tension, as if the building were breathing. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling that he was no longer alone. In the back of his mind, a cold sensation began to form. He felt a light touch on his skin, as if something tiny was crawling over him. He looked down at his hands, but there was nothing there. It was just the feeling. It would pass, he thought, returning to the pile of papers in front of him. But the discomfort remained. The crawling sensation moved across his skin, from his hands to his arms, as if something tiny were seeking a way in. In the cold room, the corpses awaited their fate. The grotesque thing, now with its body completely freed from its chemical bonds, was hungry. Its misshapen body, with exposed flesh and bones, writhed as it approached the first stored body. Its claws pierced the dead flesh, and it began to devour with terrifying speed, sucking out the remnants of life that still pulsed in the hardened flesh. Each bite made the creature grow, its distorted muscles expanding, its white eyes vibrating with ancient terror. Edward, hearing a grotesque, wet sound coming from the cold room, slowly stood up. Something was wrong. The sound was muffled, but there was something visceral about it, as if the morgue itself were being devoured. He approached the room hesitantly, his heart racing with each step. As he opened the door, the smell of rot and formaldehyde hit him hard. His stomach turned, and he instinctively put his hand to his nose. And then he saw it. In the dim light of the room, the creature was hunched over one of the bodies, devouring it in a manner so horrific that it seemed to be fusing with the dead flesh. Its white eyes slowly turned to Edward, who felt his legs tremble. Terror ran down his spine, and he recoiled in shock as the thing rose, now twice its original size, its skin pulsing as if it were alive. Edward tried to run, but the creature moved with surprising speed. He felt something cold grab his ankle, and before he could react, he was dragged to the ground. His hands scraped against the floor, searching for something to hold on to, but the strength of the thing was inhuman. The creature was getting closer, its sharp teeth gleaming in the dim light, and Edward felt a wave of nausea as he realized that it was feeding on the very flesh it had devoured, growing larger by the moment. The thing didn't just want dead bodies, it wanted a living host. Edward screamed as the creature crawled towards him, its claws slicing into his skin, piercing his muscles with terrifying ease. He could feel the creature's claws moving inside him, as if searching for something. His lungs burned, his mind spinning in a whirlwind of pain and terror. Something was crawling under his skin. Edward's eyes flew open wide with utter horror as he felt a strange presence in his body. It was inside him, moving through his veins, forcing itself through his organs, up his spine. With each movement, he felt the flesh on his body twist unnaturally. It was as if he were being transformed, as if his skin were becoming a cocoon for something much, much worse. The creature was no longer outside, it was inside. Edward, his mind invaded by the entity, began to lose track of where his body ended and the creature began. His arms, once his own, now moved erratically, not obeying his will. He could feel his skin stretching, his muscles deforming, and the creature growing inside him, taking up every possible space. The creature's nails tore at his skin in a frenzy of pain and madness, trying to rip it out, but it was too late. It already had him. Edward stood up, his legs now unsteady, and looked around with eyes that were no longer his own. The creature had gotten what it wanted, a living host. And with this new body, it knew it could feed even more. It was no longer confined to the morgue. In the darkness, as the storm continued to rage outside, Edward, or what was left of him, began to walk toward the exit, dragging his new, deformed body behind him. Edward, now a frail host, moved through the morgue with shaky steps as the creature within him adjusted to its new body. The lights flickered, as if the building itself sensed the presence of the abomination that now walked free. Its eyes, once full of life, were empty, and its skin pulsed slightly as if something were crawling just beneath the surface. He was no longer human, not in the sense we know it. As he passed the stored corpses, Edward felt an insatiable hunger grow. The creature inside him whispered in his mind, murmuring in a forgotten language, urging him to feed again. But this time, not on the dead. No, what was inside him craved the life that pulsed hot in the living. He knew that with each step, with each new breath, the hunger grew. It was an ancient hunger, a primal desire that could not be sated by the dead bodies around him. The creature wanted more. It wanted those still breathing. Edward opened the door to the morgue, feeling the cold breeze of the storm whip his face. The rain fell heavily, but he no longer felt anything. His feet, now disconnected from any human will, carried him slowly towards the darkness of the city that stretched out ahead. In the distance, the lights of the houses glowed dimly like small baits for what now inhabited his body. Inside him, the creature stirred. Every bolt of lightning in the sky seemed to feed its hunger, and Edward knew it was only a matter of time before its next target was chosen. He felt the eyes of the thing inside him, scanning the night, searching for its next victim. And then he heard it, the whisper. A sound that came not from the storm or the empty streets, but from inside his mind. The creature's voice, now strong, echoed in his skull, reverberating like an echo of 1,000 ancient demons. There are many to feed, many more. Let's go to them. His feet staggered forward, moving without control. Edward was utterly overwhelmed by the force that had taken hold of him, his body a mere tool, a vehicle for the evil that was now infiltrating the city. Within him, a small spark of consciousness still struggled, trying to emerge from the darkness. But there was no more strength. The creature was ancient, a parasite forgotten by time, with hunger and desires that transcended generations. And now, Edward was at its mercy. On the horizon, the lights of the houses began to go out, one by one, while total darkness enveloped the morgue and everything around it. Edward, or rather what he had become, disappeared into the darkness, taking with him the indescribable horror that lodged in his veins. And so, on that stormy night, the morgue became only the first stage for the rebirth of something evil, ancient and insatiable. What escaped from inside that jar could never be stopped. Now, it was loose in the world of the living.